Dr. Soto has not quite arrived yet, but as all of you probably know, he won also his electoral bid for the city council, and I'll introduce him during the break. Uh, and very importantly, or most importantly, today we have a guest speaker. Our featured ponente, as we would say in Spanish, is Randy Villegas. All of you who have the handout, the bios are there, including his, as our panelists, including Dr. Soto and please stand up, and Marcus, if you would stand. I won't be doing introductions again because it just takes too much time and we need to get to the discussion, etc. So I apologize for the length of the handout. As I say in the very first paragraph, this is a very complex story given the period that we're going to cover. It begins with Ronald Reagan and the Immigration Reform and Control Act, for example. Some of you may remember it was a boom time in the economy from roughly 1982 to 1988. Then the wheels come off, if you will, and at the same time, it's around the same time when that economic boom weakens and then finally evaporates, that because of the provisions of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, hundreds of thousands of immigrants are given the opportunity, assuming they meet certain conditions, to become legal residents of the United States. As a consequence of getting that green card, as I mentioned in the handout, it allows those immigrants who are LPRs now, legal permanent residents, to bring their immediate family members to the United States legally. And that balloons into a much larger Mexican origin population in the state, and including here in the Central Valley. And the rest of that handout provides background, what is happening on the Mexican side, because I think it's really important to understand how and why, as opposed to a lot of, well, they're poor, of course they're going to come. At that time, roughly 50 to 60% of the Mexican population is poor. And I know some people think, that's right, they all came. No, they didn't. But what is important is the consequences of that, given the politics of that time. So our speaker today is Dr. Randy Villegas, political science professor at the College of Sequoias, and he will enlighten us further about this particular period of time. With no further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Randy Villegas.
Thank you, everyone. Also, disclaimer, right, I'm going to talk about a lot today. I'm going to throw in some of my own research. We're going to jump back and forth between some time periods, from the 1970s to current. We're going to talk about state politics a little bit, the evolution of political parties here in California, and of course, some of our own local, very LATINO leaders who have paved the way and who are continuing tremendous work today. But just like I would do in my class, if I ever say something that throws you off or confused, raise your hand and we'll back into the rest. Thank you all for coming today, spending your Sunday afternoon with us. So, before we get to all that, I want to acknowledge one of the kind of first injustices as we talk about rural California and the Central Valley, which was that of colonization. Right? We know that prior to statehood, prior to all the things we're going to talk about today, this land was home to many Native American tribes and indigenous peoples who thrived off of the Central Valley's natural resources, who established community. And one thing that we often don't acknowledge is the role of the state of California. Right? The first California governor, in fact, issued an executive order calling for the extermination, quote, extermination of all Native American peoples. In fact, actually funding the assassinations and scalping of indigenous peoples. Right? So, put bluntly, this was state-sponsored genocide. Right? We're often not taught this in school. I know I certainly was not in elementary as we built California missions. Instead, we kind of focused on that aspect of it. But it's important to acknowledge and recognize as Native Americans today continue to face disproportionate health outcomes, low rates of insurance, education, extremely high rates of poverty. So it's important to acknowledge that. This map here on this slide kind of shows you roughly all the diversity of tribes and indigenous peoples that we had across the Central Valley. Over 300 different dialects spoken before colonization and the state-sponsored genocide. Of course,
and also kind of setting the context as we're going to talk about some of the challenges that Latinos encountered. Even before we get to the 70s, right, we know that there was a history of exclusion right here in the Central Valley, and that includes right here in Tulare County, right here in Kern, and right here in Fresno, right? Ku Klux Klan chapters were very active across the entire state. We know here in Tulare County, they actively attempted to recruit candidates for public offices, held public lectures, picnics even, and the occasional cross burning, according to Professor Bringhurst, who's actually a former COS professor. This picture was taken less than 100 years ago, right? Ku Klux Klan members marching through Porterville, downtown Porterville. Could you imagine that today, right? But this is a sort of legacy. In other areas of the Central Valley, at one point in the 1930s, you had the Los Angeles District Attorney actually raid the Ku Klux Klan Grand Wizard's office, a sort of leader of the KKK. And with that, he was able to obtain membership lists across California. And he decided to publicly release that information to news outlets, to cities, and actually in that process expose the fact that Bakersfield's police chief, a member of the Kern County Boards of Supervisors, several city staff members and elected officials all across the Central Valley were members of the Ku Klux Klan, right? Some tried to sort of deny it or attempt to say, well, I thought it was a religious organization, et cetera, right? While you had others that very openly embraced the Klan and their cause and white supremacy and those politics, right? But again, less than 100 years ago today, 1923. So that's the context kind of leading up to eventually getting to the 60s, the farm worker movement, right? And of course, I'm glossing over a lot of history here, but apologies. We know that the Central Valley was the epicenter for the farm worker movement here, as we saw Filipino farm workers and leaders like Philip Veracruz, Larry Itliong joined forces with Dolores Huerta, Cesar Chavez, and others in order to attempt to, establish collective bargaining for farm workers, dignity, wages, and unionization, right? We saw the 1965 grape strike result in massive changes in the way farm workers were treated, the right to fair wages, et cetera, right? And in fact, just like in the 30s, farm workers were often met with brutality at the result of local law enforcement as well as growers who opposed their efforts. In fact, there are several UFW farm worker martyrs who passed away in this effort, including 24-year-old Nagi Daifala, an immigrant and Arabic member of the UFW who was killed by a Kern deputy who struck him with a flashlight in the back of the head. There was also Juan de la Cruz, who was shot by a strikebreaker who was later acquitted in court, right? At one point, Bobby Kennedy actually came to Kern County and there was a public hearing held where he questioned the Kern County Sheriff and the District Attorney asking why farm workers were being arrested for exercising their rights. And the sheriff said something along the lines of, well, Kennedy said, how can you arrest somebody if they haven't broken the law? And the sheriff replied, well, they're ready to break the law, right? And as the audience sort of erupted in boos. And Kennedy quite, point blank said, I suggest during the interim period of time, the luncheon period of time, that the Kern County deputy and district attorney read the Constitution of the United States. It's one of the most politically sort of polite clapbacks I've heard in my life. But that is a video. You can actually watch it on YouTube and see that recording. It's part of a documentary of this effort, right? Unfortunately, Bobby Kennedy, after running for presidency and winning the California primary, would go on to be assassinated that night, really marking a traumatic event in the history for Latino rights struggles, farm worker rights in the region, right? Since the 1980s, the union's membership and prominence has declined as a result of powerful agricultural interests. We talk about Reagan and several other leaders who began to push back. Actually, during the 1965 grape strike, you actually had the government buying all these grapes that weren't being sold. And so you had an entire social movement, not only up against the struggles of their employers, et cetera, but actually against the California government, who was supporting the growers in this effort, right? Please go ahead. So, as we talk about some parallels in immigration, in that handout, you'll read all about Proposition 187, right? This initiative to essentially attempt to stop undocumented residents from receiving any sort of state services, right? Whether we're talking about healthcare, public education, food aid, and more. And this was in the 1990s, right? A very different California from the California we see today, in some ways. And we'll get to that later. But you had students rebelling, right, protesting against this sort of initiative, which targeted their families, which targeted their parents, their loved ones, their friends. And during this time in the 1990s, gubernatorial candidate Pete Wilson and the Republican Party did a pretty good job of scapegoating the immigrant community, engaged in this sort of nativist, anti-immigrant rhetoric long before Donald Trump announced his presidential campaign, right? Governor Pete Wilson would be elected, and Proposition 187 would also pass by a pretty wide margin. Later, it would be ruled unconstitutional by the California State Supreme Court. And yet, we see some of these parallels and attacks on the immigrant community throughout time. For example, in Arizona, we saw this infamous Papers, Please laws, where Sheriff Joe Arpaio essentially tried to deputize his sheriffs to act as immigration agents, pulling people over, asking them if they were in the country illegally, right? After this was ruled unconstitutional, or aspects of the law at least, were ruled unconstitutional, Arpaio continued to essentially push his deputies to stop Latino residents, even though they were only detaining them on the suspicion that they might be undocumented, right? Eventually, a report found that his sheriff's office regularly violated the rights of Latinos, stopped them based on racial profiling, and you might think justice was served as Arpaio was convicted and was set to, go to trial, eventually maybe go to jail. But wouldn't you know, his good friend Donald Trump issued him a full pardon, so he didn't really see any day inside jail. Instead, he ran for sheriff again in 2020, where he lost again, right? Which speaks to some of the growing political power, not just in Arizona, but across the United States, right? This photo, which you see here in 2016, is actually a photo that I captured prior to becoming a professor, prior to going to graduate school. I was a journalist for a local youth media organization called South Kern Seoul, and I actually traveled to the 2016 Republican National Convention. And this was a group of protesters from an organization called Mi Gente. And their goal was to essentially block off, at the time, nominee Trump from entering the convention and officially receiving the Republican nomination. So their idea was to literally build a human wall to wall off Trump from entering into the convention. And you can see kind of the parallels between communities being attacked in the 90s and communities being attacked in early 2016, and the sort of nativism and scapegoating of the immigrant community when it came to these politics. If you look up some of the old commercials from the 1990s from Governor Pete Wilson, you see music, very dark music, as they attempt to depict people running across a highway, and again, just really scapegoating the immigrant community, right? But as we've seen in California, as a result of Proposition 187, we saw immense backlash at the same time as more individuals began to think about, hey, maybe I was a legal permanent resident before, maybe it's time to become a citizen, right? Or you began to see other communities and even young people voting at different rates, and today we see a much different California when it comes to immigration politics, but we'll get to that. Additionally, in the early sort of 2000s, we saw more mobilization, right? Particularly when it came to the Sensenbrenner bill, right, in 2006. This bill that would have attempted to criminalize being undocumented in the country, right? And we saw massive protests, including in Kern County, in Tulare, in Fresno. You had individuals who walked out of school, young people, students who walked out of their schools on May 1st and on several other days as the movement kind of began to organize itself. And really, this was a movement to not only stop the Sensenbrenner bill, but to essentially call for humane and just immigration reform with a path to citizenship, right? How many of you, just by show of hands, participated or know somebody who participated in these 2006 marches, or maybe you missed school or you missed work? A few of us, right? I actually remember I missed school on that day on May 1st, and the next day my teacher asked me hey, why weren't you in class, right? And I said, what everybody's parents told them to say, tell me you were sick, right? And I remember my dad saying something like, I was sick of the government. So I told her I'm sick of the government. And then she gave me in-school suspension for a week, right? And so, but this was the kind of context, right? Individuals were pushing back. Many political pundits call this the awakening of the sleeping giant, right? That is to say that Latinos have immense political power when it comes to the polls, when it comes to social movements, when it comes to mobilization. But oftentimes, the sleeping giant is sleeping, or napping, as I like to say, right? So what does it take for these communities, for young people to be mobilized, to engage in politics, right? And additionally, the Central Valley is a special place to me because it has a very special context, right? I like to think about this juxtaposition of the valley, and I want to quote a scholar named Isao Fujimoto. And he talks about the Central Valley, and he says, quote, "The Central Valley is very special. It is the richest agricultural region in the history of the world. The public image of the Central Valley is that it is an agricultural productivity. But I say the wealth is really in all of the people that are here, tremendously diverse. There are about 3,000 counties in the country. If you rank them according to agricultural productivity, the top 10 usually have almost all San Joaquin Valley counties. Number 1, 2, 3 for the last 50 years has been Fresno, Tulare, and Kern County. And yet, the poorest cities are also there. That's called the contradiction, to have poverty and wealth in one place. That is why it's very important to really start examining these kinds of questions when it comes to poverty, participation, social movements, right? We know that forces joined together in May of 2006 to stop the Sensenbrenner bill and were successful, but we haven't seen a bipartisan, comprehensive, and just pathway to citizenship or form of immigration reform since the 1980s, as you read about in that handout, right? And yet, Latinos have this sort of collective consciousness, as scholars call it, this idea of linked fate among one another, right? When someone is attacked who looks like you or is from your community, then it's up to you to also respond, right? But with these localized threats emerging nationwide, we also saw threats emerging locally, particularly in the Central Valley. For example, former city council member, today County Board of Supervisor David Couch, in Bakersfield at the time, decided that he wanted to push for his own localized Proposition 187. He asked city staff to investigate how the city could deny services to undocumented residents in the city, right? We're not talking just sewage and trash, but police forces, firefighters, et cetera, right? Public goods and services. Fortunately, that effort failed, but we later saw parallels, right? As the state of California moved to establish sanctuary counties, sanctuary cities, and eventually SB 54, the sort of sanctuary state bill, which attempts to limit cooperation between law enforcement and ICE agencies. Supervisor Couch asked and pleaded for the county of Kern to establish itself as a, quote, non-sanctuary county with full support of Sheriff Donnie Youngblood. Youngblood was quoted as saying, "I don't know what sanctuary is, I just know I don't want to be a part of it," right? Additionally, we see these sorts of localized threats. My own research looked at the participation of youth from mixed status families in the Central Valley from 2017 to about 2021 and this year when I was able to finish. And so I want to share a little bit about what that looks like for young people on the ground who live with this sort of fear on a daily basis, particularly at a time in 2016 to 2020 when heights seemed even more heightened, or sorry, when fears seemed even more heightened, right? For example, this was a quote from a young woman I spoke to from Bakersfield, California. And she told me about her experiences growing up in a mixed status family where her parents were undocumented, where she was undocumented, her siblings were US citizens, and there was a fear around interacting with law enforcement, right? She had been robbed on her way home from school. And for hours, she and her family debated whether or not they should call the police. Why is this? Because they saw Donnie Youngblood at a photo op with President Trump at the border, right? And they knew Youngblood was very adamant about wanting to cooperate with ICE agencies, right? And so she said, if it's a fear, it's calling them to help us, is it only gonna backfire on us, you know? I went home crying because it was literally down the street and we were like, do we call the police? Do we not? If it had been a kidnapping, if it had been a rape, who do you call out of fear from everything? It shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't fear our own safety net, right? And I've heard other countless stories from young individuals debating whether or not their family should call law enforcement as a result of something that happened in the family, a robbery, an assault, etc., and yet questioning whether or not it was safe to do so because they've heard countless stories about immigrants being arrested at courthouses, being transferred from being transferred from jails to ICE detention centers, including Mesa Verde. And yet, we also saw young people respond to these threats, particularly in the Central Valley through the work of several community-based organizations, youth organizing groups, to call for justice and immigrant justice in the Central Valley. Here we see a group of youth protesting outside of the Mesa Verde Immigrant Detention Center, a private facility owned by GeoCorp in Bakersfield, California, which houses approximately 300 to, I want to say, 400 individuals who've all been detained and are awaiting a court date in front of a judge, right? And we know that for youth, whether it's community-based organizations or their peers or their parents, empowering them to make a difference, they can make a tremendous impact on local policies that shape what happens. We saw this happen in McFarland, where GEO attempted to expand this immigrant detention center, and the City Council and Planning Commission was under immense pressure to approve this, yet the Planning Commission voted no, after you saw hundreds of people show up and rally against this expansion. Later on, the City Council would override this failed vote at the Planning Commission. California passed a law which would eventually try and phase out private immigrant detention centers and private jails in the state of California. But it's kind of been in legal limbo as courts go back and forth over whether or not it's unconstitutional. And yet, we've seen that young people and communities can respond and can mobilize to threats here in the Central Valley, right? And Dr. Zaragoza, where are you at? Oh, approximately how much time do I have, or what is my stopping point? Just because.
Stopping point in about 20 minutes.
Okay, professors can talk forever, so I'll speed through, right? So we know there's all different kinds of participation, right? Voting, posting things online, protesting, social movements, as we saw with the farm worker movement. And yet, when we look at young people, unfortunately, we don't see those same kinds of trends. Millennials, Gen Z, are among the most diverse here in California and across the United States. 7 out of 10 are people of color. 1 in every 3 Californians are millennials. I don't have stats for Gen Z yet, but we'll get that. Unfortunately, they're less likely to exercise their rights to vote for many reasons, as we'll talk about. As a result of this, our electorate in California is not as diverse, right? I'm going to show you this next graph, which is, I don't want to date myself, but it's the first election I was able to participate in, right? Old people, this was among the lowest voter turnout in over 70 years, right, across the nation. Old people, ages 65 to 74, about 57 turned out to vote. Young people who were eligible, 18 to 24, 8% turned out to vote, right? How does it make you all feel? A little disappointed, old. Some of the old people are like, yeah, I voted, right? I want to show you how it made me feel, right? I was pretty mind blown. I couldn't understand it. How is it that old people were outvoting us young people, right, with so much energy that are ready to go hit the streets, et cetera? But it's for a variety of reasons, right? It's by the very fact, the way campaigns are driven, right, and the way people are mobilized, right? Rosenstone and Hansen, 2 very famous political scientists, wrote this phenomenal book where they argue that people are mobilized based upon the strategic decisions of elected leaders and politicians who run campaigns, right? Unfortunately, we kind of get this catch-22 cycle of exclusivity because of this. Why is this? Because campaigns, like many things in life, are driven by money and dollars, right? So therefore, campaigns have a limited amount of resources, whether we're talking about time, volunteers, money, et cetera. So how do you spend those resources? Well, typically, campaigns end up targeting high propensity voters. That is, voters who are older, who tend to be more affluent, have more money, who lean disproportionately white, et cetera, right? And that's because they want to win, which makes sense, right? Where are you going to spend your money most effectively? Unfortunately, this leads us to a cycle that we're getting better at breaking, but it still kind of ends up, right? For example, I remember my first campaign. I was super excited. It was a library initiative in Kern County. We were going to, pass the smallest sales tax possible to attempt to fund our libraries so they'd be open 5 days a week and with full hours, because currently most branches are only open 2 to 3 days a week. So I remember getting in my car, drove downtown, got my walking list, super excited, and then I drove 20 more minutes across town to this gated community that I had only been to previously to knock, during Halloween for the king-size candy bars. And so I knocked for a few hours, I'm talking to people, and yeah, we're getting out the vote, it's great. But I started questioning, why am I not talking to people in my own barrio? Why am I not talking to people who look like me, right? And it's because, again, campaigns, whether they're candidate-centered or initiative-centered, tend to target these higher propensity voters to get out the vote, right? So this leads to this catch-22 cycle. Low-income communities, young communities, communities of color aren't targeted because they don't vote. These same communities don't vote because they're not targeted to the same extent, right? So it's kind of a twofold solution that we need to have moving forward. One, campaigns, particularly nonprofit organizations that do nonpartisan work and attempt to educate voters in non-election cycles, need to continue investing into reaching out to those communities, right? At the same time, it's up to our very communities to break those cycles, to continue to establish, new cycles. If your parents didn't vote, right, you can break that cycle and continue by encouraging other young people, your peers, your children, spouses, family members, etc., to vote. So that way campaigns know that they can't ignore our communities on the ground, right? And many of our campaigns have done a phenomenal job, especially in more recent years, of targeting these voters, right? And changing these trends and changing these outcomes. So next I'm going to shift to some of our own leadership here in Tulare County and throughout the Central Valley to kind of give you a field of where politics are today. We know Jesus Gamboa was first elected to the city council years ago, right? The first Latino and only Latino elected to city council in our city's 152-year history, right? And fun fact, until Mayor Gamboa, there hadn't been a repeated mayor in Visalia for over 50 years, and I think he served 3 times as mayor. Here in the room with us, we also have Dr. Lucia Vasquez, first elected in 2011. Where are you, Lucia? Yes, first elected in 2011, reelected or reappointed in 2016 with no opposition. Very narrowly lost re-election in 2020 by I think just about 8 votes, right? So again, every vote matters, as we'll show you towards the end of this presentation. Sticking with school board, we also have Louis Montion Jr., who served for the Visalia Unified School Board from 1990 to about 1999. First appointed in 1990, he would go on to win election in his own right for 2 consecutive elections after that. And these were during at-large elections, right? So 2 different ways we elect individuals. We can do elections at large, meaning everybody in the entire city or county, votes for one or several individuals, and then the top voters get elected. We also have district elections in which we, create districts in every city or county to elect representatives of those specific communities. And throughout history, what we've seen is that at-large elections typically make it very difficult to elect candidates of color, Latino communities, and Latino elected officials, right? Which we'll get to shortly after. Mr. Montion was well recognized, visited the White House several times, was Man of the Year, PTA Hall of Fame, Hispanic Educator of the Year, and helped co-found the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce and Latino Rotary here in town. And he also paved the way for other elected officials, right? Juan Guerrero was quoted as being inspired by Mr. Montion to eventually toss his own hat into the ring to run for school board, right? For me, he set an example of what a school board member should be: well-informed, a good school leader, and accessible, right? And even though both of these candidates were able to find success in those at-large election systems, they knew that it would be increasingly challenging for more Latino elected officials to be elected moving forward. And so they would push for by-district elections in the coming years. We also have Lali Mojeno, appointed to the Tulare County Board of Supervisors by the California governor, right? There was one other Latino also appointed to the California County Boards of Supervisors, but unfortunately both fell short of being reelected into the Tulare County Boards of Supervisors. A fierce advocate for our farm workers communities, she started the Women's Farm Workers Conference in 1999. This year, I believe, I don't know if she's here today, but it's sold out. This has grown phenomenally over the years, and Lali Mojeno continues to be a champion for underserved communities here in the Central Valley, farm workers, and really anywhere that there's injustice, right? But back to the sort of district versus at-large elections, because this was history right here in Visalia. In 2014, there were several individuals, one of them sitting right here in this room, Dr. Robert Aguilar, if you would raise your hand. Can we give Dr. Aguilar a hand, please? So Dr. Aguilar, along with Carlos Medina, as well as Miguel Fierro and Luis Montion, who we mentioned earlier, filed a lawsuit against the city of Visalia for not moving for district elections and continuing to do at-large elections, right? And a judge ruled in their favor, essentially saying that they had violated the California Voting Rights Act by continuing to engage in at-large elections, right? And so, also mentioned here, Jesus Gamboa, again, the one elected Latino official to the Visalia City Council, was also a fierce advocate and proponent for these district elections, speaking several times. And And also a fun fact about this, 2 years prior to this, so prior to the lawsuit even being filed, the council had created a special committee to look into this, to look into whether or not they should switch to district elections as opposed to at-large elections. And the committee unanimously found that they should have, and that their current election system was discriminatory towards minority candidates. And despite the almost near unanimous recommendation from their own special committee, they still pushed back against it, or at least several council members did. Eventually, Judge Melinda Reed would rule that the city would have to move to district elections by 2016. And the city council is a 5-member body. 2 of these council members at the time, Amy Shucklian and Steve Nelson, still voted against approving this settlement agreement to move to district elections instead of by-large. Now, as of 2016 and moving forward, Visalia City Council would move towards district elections. Unfortunately, which was a huge victory for our communities, right? The idea was we're going to be able to have the opportunity to elect more candidates, and Latinos are going to have more political power and clout to do so and to elect a person of their choice. We didn't see the immediate results of this. Since that lawsuit was filed, we had no Latinos who won election to the city council. Part of this was we had a lack of Latino candidates, right? That is until today. We have us in the room. Manuel Soto, if you'd like to stand real quick, wave hi to folks. So, yes. So in fact, we have history in the making right here in this year. As a result of this lawsuit that Dr. Aguilar and so many fierce advocates put forward, we now have the 2nd Latino city council member ever. And I have to, legal disclaimer, projected winner as votes are certified in the coming weeks, but it's looking good, right? So again, this is history right here in the making and a result of all of the work that many of these leaders have put forward to pave the road to elect more candidates here in Visalia, in Tulare County, etc., right? And of course, we can't forget about Mr. Eddie Valero in the room here. You want to wave to people real quick, Eddie? Yes. So Eddie, 4 years ago, was not only the first Mexican-American ever elected to the Tulare County Boards of Supervisors, this year he became the very first to ever win re-election. Again, legal disclaimer, projected. But, and Eddie, even before joining the County Boards of Supervisors, served on the Cutler-Orosi School District, has been a champion for clean drinking water for underserved communities, infrastructure, and also played a very key role most recently in advocating for equitable maps. So just as we saw that those city council maps didn't allow Latinos to have political power to elect a candidate of their choice, every county, congressional district, et cetera, all went through this process within the last couple of years, including the county of Tulare. So there were several organizations, leaders, many people in this room. Where is Donna? I think many folks working on this effort to make sure we had equitable maps and fair representation. So as a result of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, moving forward, Tulare County now has 3 Latino citizen voting age population districts within the 5. So moving forward, there's a potential for even more elected leaders to emerge, for Latinos to be able to have a candidate of their choice and their say, right? And this is why I know maps aren't always the sexiest topic in politics, but especially important moving forward to make sure we have fair lines, fair districts for communities to have a voice. I'm gonna shift a little bit to kind of statewide politics here, right? One of the first Latino champions in the California State Legislature was Dr. Raymond Gonzalez from Bakersfield, from Kern County. And to give you an idea of what Dr. Raymond Gonzalez had to overcome in this election, he was in a district that had fewer than 8% of voters that were registered Democrats. And he was a Democrat running in a very strong Republican district. He was a professor at Bakersfield College, one of the first Latino faculty members there, later at CSUB as well. And his colleague, Bill Thomas, who was also a professor at Bakersfield College, basically encouraged him to run for assembly and said, hey, you should do this. And Raymond Gonzalez decided, yes, I will. And he ran a corporate-free campaign, rejecting donations from large businesses, from lobbyists. And this was way before, we get to this old white guy from Vermont talking about being corporate-free, right? Instead, he focused on a door-knocking campaign with grassroots support, and he pulled off a major upset by mobilizing minority voters who hadn't been voting before, and he won by just about 3,000 votes, right? Dr. Gonzalez was quoted as saying, "My desk was filled with checks from lobbyists. People said, 'What are you going to do with those?' He said, 'I sent them back,' right? He famously returned a $600 check to a lobbyist with a note reading, 'No thanks,' right? One of the first original founders of the Latino caucus in the California State Assembly, right? Later on, he would go on to become a diplomat, a staunch advocate for Latino representation, a school board trustee for the Bakersfield City School District, until his health led him to resign in 2017, and he passed away a year later at the age of 80. But interestingly enough, Dr. Gonzalez was betrayed by Bill Thomas, the very faculty member, his close friend that had encouraged him to run for office, then decided to run against him 2 years later, right? And this is how we get to kind of the Republican political machine, if you will, in the Central Valley. This is a quote from Dr. Gonzalez. "Bill Thomas, my pal, my friend, he lured me into a trap and then ran against me," right? Again, kind of suspecting that Bill Thomas did this purposefully, so that way when he ran again against him in 2 years, he would have an easier road as opposed to trying to run against a fellow Republican incumbent. And Bill Thomas, of course, goes on to win. He later gets elected to Congress, becomes very influential on the Powerful Ways and Means Committee. Here we see Bill Thomas. And Bill Thomas had a former intern who worked for him by the name of Kevin McCarthy. You might have heard of him. He would become his district director and then kind of follow a similar path into politics, running for assembly, then later running for Congress. Currently, he's vying to become Speaker of the House. Wouldn't you know it? Mr. McCarthy also had an intern who later served as a legislative aide, became his district director, and now ran for the California State Assembly, who is now representing parts of Visalia as a result of the redistricting efforts. So you kind of start to notice a pattern here, right? And it's not by coincidence, it's by design, right? Because we have a very well-oiled political machine on the Republican Party here in the Central Valley. And that political machine is the Abernathy machine, also known as Western Pacific Research, incredibly popular with Republican candidates here in the Central Valley. They are responsible for electing all the folks you see pictured here. Shannon Grove, Devin Nunes, Karen Go, Kevin McCarthy, et cetera, right? Their campaign started with Roy Ashburn, who ran to be a supervisor, then later on was elected to state senate before resigning in a bit of a scandal. A very staunch conservative, very anti-LGBTQ, and he was pulled over leaving a gay nightclub and was pulled over with a DUI and was outed publicly. And he later resigned and left the Republican Party as well. They were also responsible for the recall election, right? Or at least played a very huge role in the recall of Gray Davis. Just, again, a very powerful political machine. A lot of Republican leaders feel like they have to sort of kiss the ring before they decide to run for office, right? Today, Mark Abernathy has since passed away, but his wife, Kathy Abernathy, continues to play a huge role in this Republican machine. What about on the Democratic side of the aisle, right? Historically, we had a lot of moderate blue dog Democrats, right? Moderate or conservative, whatever word you want to use. Walter Stern, Dorothy Donahue. And throughout time, we've also had local Democrats end up leaving positions, right? Particularly within the oil industry. Willie Rivera, for example, elected as the youngest council member in the early 2000s to the Bakersfield City Council, ends up resigning to take a job to work for the California Independent Petroleum Association and later Era Energy. Previously, he worked for Rudy Salas and former state senator Michael Rubio, who also resigned from the state senate to begin a job with Chevron, right? So you begin to see a bit of a pattern. In Fresno, Henry Perea, assembly member, similarly also resigns in the middle of his term to work for the oil industry. Former state assemblywoman Nicole Parra, who has taught a few classes at CSUB, at Bakersfield College, previously ran for Congress and then state senate more recently. There's also a lot of feuds, even within the Democratic Party, particularly Parra and Flores had their own challenges, right? Parra's father was on the Board of Supervisors, and Flores supported a challenger to her father named Michael Rubio, and pictured above here. So then when Dean Flores was termed out of the Senate, Franz Flores, his mom, ran to retain his seat, and in true kind of petty fashion, Nicole Parra endorsed her opponent, endorsing a Republican, right, which is very bad in party politics, right? You don't endorse the other party. Franz Flores would go on to lose that race. Just a couple years later, Nicole Parra's father, Pete Parra, and Flores' mother, Fran Flores, they went toe-to-toe to run and be the Democratic candidate in an assembly seat. Flores won, and then would go on to face a Republican by the name of David Valadao. And Nicole Parra endorses David Valadao as opposed to supporting the Democratic candidate. 10 years later, Nicole Parra runs against David Valadao for Congress, which he could have used that ad from 10 years ago. But a lot of crazy politics, right? And when you see the internal struggles and this kind of inter-party fighting and factionalism within the party. But we still see candidates like Rudy Salas, assembly member, State Senator Melissa Hurtado, the youngest elected female state senator in the Central Valley, who focus on bipartisanship, who focus on this more moderate approach. Salas currently running for Congress in a very close election. We'll see where he ends up after ballots are counted. Similarly, Melissa Hurtado running to stay in the California State Senate, also in a somewhat close election. And we'll have to see where the votes lie at the end of the day. And yet, I'm going to kind of skip over this just because of time's sake, but we have seen other young elected officials kind of on the more left side of the spectrum. Jose Garola ran to be Arvin City Council member at the age of 19, is elected mayor at the age of 25. He fights for an oil setback bill, which requires new oil wells to be built at least 300 feet away from schools, public parks, etc. The oil industry comes after him and two other candidates and funds 3 special interest candidates. And this isn't Arvin. We're not talking Sacramento. We're not talking about San Francisco. This is Arvin, California, 20,000 people. And they lose. They only elect one candidate, right? So are we seeing a different kind of blue wave? We've seen other young elected Latino leaders. Brian Osorio, mayor of Delano, elected to city council at the age of 25. Jewel Hurtado, a young mother and community college student, elected to her city council seat in Kingsburg. We see Bernie Sanders emerge as the winner in the California Democratic primary against Joe Biden, including winning here in Tulare, Kern, Fresno, etc. So, of course, we talked about the Latino candidates making history today in this room and with us. We also have several other elected leaders, of course. I can't include everybody, so apologies if I miss anyone. But Teresa Ramos, who served for years on the hospital board here before being narrowly defeated in 2016. Ambar Rodriguez returns the favor 4 years later and wins her election to serve on the hospital board, right? Fresno City Council, for the first time in many years, elects a Latino majority city council in 2018, and moving forward, right? So where do we go from here, right? Just very quickly, your vote matters. And this is what I share with my students who are cynical or think their votes don't matter. Multi-million-dollar sales tax in Bakersfield passes by 97 votes, right? A city council seat that we talked about, Jewel Hurtado won her election by only 8 votes. Here in Tulare County, Maribel Reynosa wins her election to Dinuba City Council by 2 single votes, right? When people tell you their vote doesn't matter, you show them these examples, right? And even closer elections in 2020, Tilo Cortez Jr., City of Wasco, wins by 1 single vote, right? Which is insane. Maricopa, a city council race at large, so they elect the top 3 vote getters. There's a tie for 3rd place. So who gets elected to city council? I asked my students about this example. I'm like, what do you think they did? They're like, surely they did a recount. Surely they did a runoff between these 2 candidates. No, instead they flipped a coin to determine the winner, right? Democracy. So just to not be a total bummer, right? 2014, I showed you those low numbers. We have seen exponential increases in youth turnout over the last few years in 2018. We're still going to wait on numbers in 2022, but things are actually looking pretty decent for the youth voter turnout in 2022. I was reading today that many Gen Z and millennial candidate votes ended up canceling votes over the age of 65 by a prominent pollster from Harvard. So as I start to close off, I mentioned before starting, how much I got, like a minute? 2 minutes? Okay, cool. Why is this work important to me? I mentioned before I started graduate school, before I became a professor, I was an organizer, I was a journalist in Kern County, where I helped organize a lot of different events. This was after a local Sikh man had been attacked outside the Habit Burger. A white man came up to him, started yelling, "You're a Muslim, you're a terrorist, get the F out of my country," threw his drink at him. National headlines, Bakersfield hate crimes, right? And so I reached out to him, a man by the name of Balmeet Singh, and we brought together the Latino community, the Sikh community, the Black community at this event in the pouring rain to say we weren't going to stand for racism and intolerance in our community, right? Additionally, you see these huge VOTA letters. If you look closely, you might see some barbed wire fence here. And this is because this was outside of the Mesa Verde Immigrant Detention Center a few years ago, where I actually got to go in, speak to some of the detainees. I spoke to a young woman named Norma, who was 25 years old, and who had been in there for 9 months, still waiting for a court date. And so I was originally writing a story about, what conditions were like in Mesa Verde. And she told me all about her dreams, her aspirations. Her brother or her boyfriend had been murdered. And so she fled the country fearing that she was next. She wanted to stay with her sister, but was apprehended at the border. And so it was just a very surreal moment for me, sitting across from someone around the same age, knowing that we could be in very different positions if I didn't have this piece of paper with a 9-digit social security number on it, right? So I asked her, when do you all have recreational time? She told me these days and these days from this time to this time. And so I was like, great, we're gonna plan a rally outside, right? And originally I was inspired because I saw Juanes and John Legend performed outside of a prison in Arizona. So I was like, let's bring Juanes and John Legend to Bakersfield. But of course, we didn't have that kind of money. But what we did do instead is we hired a banda with large brass instruments who played music for the detainees as they were outside to let them know that there were still people out there caring about them, advocating for them, and advocating for a comprehensive and just immigration reform with a path to citizenship. In 2017, I helped organize the May Day March in Kern County, California, in Bakersfield. Don't like how they put us next to homeboy over here, but it is what it is. But we made it not just about immigration, but we talked about mental health care, access to education, poverty, among many different issues, right? And to close off, and kind of why I'm here, why I do a lot of the things I do, I wanted to share this quote with you. It says, being the son of undocumented parents motivated me to be a voice for the voiceless. I cast my ballot knowing that it not only represented me, but also my parents and a lot of people in my community who don't have that opportunity and that privilege to vote. And so those are words spoken by me that are currently at the California State Capitol Museum. And so that's my big head next to my bigger head. And so I share this with you not to make my head any bigger, but to say if there's an issue that you care about in your community, whether it's immigration or healthcare or participation or representation, then you too can be a voice in your community through whatever medium you care about, whether that's through music. Maybe you do pick up a megaphone and organize a rally. Maybe you write a song. Maybe you make an art piece. Maybe you spread the word on social media. But you all can play an impact in all of these issues that matter to individuals. And to say, if this brown kid from the Valley can end up in the California State Capitol Museum, then all of you can do anything that you set your mind to, right? Which is also why I too decided to throw my own hat in the ring and ran for school board here in Visalia, right? And I'm the projected winner of my race, along with several others. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And again, following in the footsteps of so many leaders who have paved the road before me, like all of us, people here in this room, I stepped up to serve when there was a vacancy on the board last year, ran this campaign to fill out the rest of the term, like Emmanuel, like Supervisor Valero, like so many folks here in this room. Throughout this lecture, we discuss many firsts, right? Who are the first in their families to run for office, to go to university, to do all these things. And yet, I want to make sure that moving forward, and I'm sure I can speak for everybody here, that we want to make sure we're not the last, right? So moving forward, as we look to young leaders like Crystal, Marcus, and so many other young people in Tulare County and in the room, I want to know, and I know we're going to make sure to ensure that we're not the last and that we continue to grow this movement, leadership in the Valley, and ultimately make the Valley a better place. I've talked a lot. That kind of concludes my talk. So thank you all for your attention.
Consistent with our format from the past, we're going to allow about 10 minutes for Q&A for anyone in the audience. If you can raise your hand, and I'll call on you so that Dr. Villegas can respond to your question and comment. I'm sure he would love to hear some questions from the audience. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? Brendan.
Yeah. Do you want me to use that?
I just want to, for those in the back who may not hear the question, the question had to do with where are the young people, especially given the fact that he's a professor at COS, where is their political consciousness now?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I like to think about their political consciousness being undiscovered, right? They may not know all the ins and outs of what a primary election is, what registering to vote is, what that process looks like. But in many ways, they've lived these political issues on a daily basis when their parents don't have access to healthcare, when they work long hours at work. When I explain to them that farm workers, for example, were excluded from the New Deal policies that we talk about in the 1930s, not guaranteed overtime like other positions and other works, and not guaranteed the same rights to organize as other industries, they start to question, why is that the way it is? Right? And we talk about these things in our class. So throughout the semester, it's kind of a long discovery process. Some people come in with a little bit better idea of the political process, so to speak. But I like to think of it as kind of a collective journey, right? And I think by the end of the semester, they come out with, I hope, obviously I'm biased, right? But I hope they come out with the ability to recognize that they themselves can play an impact in their communities. And one thing I like to emphasize too, which I didn't include in this slideshow, was also many of our students can't participate in these traditional forms of participation because they're undocumented, maybe they're too young, and so they can't vote, they can't donate to campaigns. But I show them examples. For example, a young woman by the name of Giselle Gasca, who works with an organization in Fresno called Mi Familia Vota, and they all dedicated themselves as undocumented students to register and mobilize 1,000 people on their behalf, right? And that's powerful, and that is playing a role in elections. We've seen in Southern California and other cities where undocumented folks, young people, have gone on to play a tremendous role in supporting or opposing candidates that they believe in. So I hope that answers your question a little bit.
I'm going to take the the liberty here of asking a question. You were involved in an effort stemming from your time at UCLA, and there's other organizations like 99 Roots and so on. Could you talk about those efforts to improve the turnout of eligible youth voters?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2018, right after I started my PhD program, I connected with a professor named Dr. Tariquez, who teaches in sociology at UC Santa Cruz. Now she's the head of the Latino Research Center at UCLA. And we started this project called the Central Valley Freedom Summer, which was modeled after the 1964 Freedom Summer. Does anyone know what that is? Or a few folks shaking their head, right? In 1964, you had this group of college students from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, mainly on the East Coast, but they all got together and they mobilized. They went to places like Alabama, Mississippi, places in the South where they knew that black voters were being discriminated against, they weren't being allowed to register, and they dedicated themselves to mobilizing and registering as many voters of color as they could. 3 young men died for trying to do that. They were beaten and tortured to death by local sheriffs and members of the Klan. Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerner, right, were their last names. Thankfully, nobody died in our effort, right? But we wanted to model that here. We said, we have a lot of folks here in the Central Valley that aren't registered to vote, that aren't contacted, especially young people and low-income people and communities of color, right? The folks that traditional campaigns don't target. So we dedicated ourselves to doing nonpartisan voter registration across the valley, and we were able to register thousands and thousands of young people to let them know that they were able to activate their political voice in the future. And some of that, we won't take credit for the 2018 increase, right? There's a lot of different reasons for that increase from 2014 to 2018. But part of that is because you had organizations like 99 Roots, the Dolores Huerta Foundation, the Central Valley Freedom Summer, doing that work of knocking on that door, of somebody's door who has never been knocked on before, making phone calls and reaching out to young people to let them know that their political voice matters.
Any other questions from the audience? Randy has stunned you into silence. All right.
I love the awkward silence.
Okay.
That's how I met my wife. Mm-hmm. kind of structural or systemic racism within, I think we can look at the effects of that today, right? We go over redlining in my class, for example, right? We know that, on the west side of the tracks in Fresno, people of color were not allowed to buy on the east side, right? Why do we see, I ask students, can you see any differences between Clovis and Fresno, right? Usually the results are pretty apparent, right? So I think we do continue to see disproportionate effects of a lot of these historical practices like redlining, discrimination today, if that's what you're asking. And I do think, we can look at, for example, there's a study out there that shows that white individuals and black individuals use drugs at nearly identical rates, but black people are 2.7 times more likely to be incarcerated for a drug charge, right? And why is that when we look at systemic issues in society? So I do think we've made a lot of progress, but I do think, we've still got a ways to go in many sense, especially when we look at access to healthcare, education, rates of poverty, and others.
Any other questions? Yes, Lucia.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on the first question around ethnic studies, just point blank, I'm a strong supporter, a strong champion for ethnic studies, and I think we should require it before the California state law requires it years down the road. As to whether or not individual students who have taken ethnic studies participate at higher rates politically, I haven't seen any research yet. Perhaps our professor of ethnic studies here in the room might be able to help us answer that. But I will say, there's so many other tremendous effects of ethnic studies in terms of increased GPA, number of units are earned, students' connectivity to their culture, to their schools, and just tend to have higher success rates overall. In terms of that second question of how do we get campaigns to look at those lower propensity voters, I think it's twofold. One, on the effort of campaigns, right? Investing that money, that time, that resources into reaching out to those voters, but also in our communities ourselves, right? And breaking those cycles of non-participation, knowing that, reaching out, calling your mom, your tío, call your ex. Did you vote today, right? Are you registered? I know it sounds funny, but like, hey, it's like that kind of work that we have to do in order for people to realize that this is something that matters. This is something that should be embedded within our communities if you're eligible, and that politics doesn't stop after November 8th, right? After whether your candidate wins or loses, or your party or whatever, it's up to you to hold that elected official accountable to the views, values, and beliefs that you believe in. So I think that's part of democracy, and I think that's also part of what we can do is not only pressuring those candidates and campaigns, including my own, right, but doing that work within ourselves and within our own communities to get out the vote, to make sure folks are registered, and basically handle business. So.
Well, we're going to take a break, but please join me in thanking and appalling for a very thought-provoking presentation from Dr. Randy Villegas.
Thank you all.
We're going to take a short break. Please come back in about 10 minutes. And having a discussion here. Please feel free to ask questions after every comment. Just raise your hand and I'll try and call on you. But I want to start with the first question, if I may, and then please feel free to ask your questions. And I'm going to start with Mr. Soto. At the time that I put together in my head some of these questions, I had no idea what the election results were going to be. I was in Arizona trying to blow up as many voters for Mrs. Lake as I could. No, I'm kidding. I didn't do that. But be that as it may, I want to start with Mr. Soto, if I may. And Randy showed some incredible increases of useful voters, but if you have two 18-year-olds and then four 18-year-olds vote, that's a 100% increase. In other words, these figures might exaggerate the participation of young people in elections and so on. Given your campaign, etc., do you believe that some of the support, and maybe much of the support that you received, was because of the quality of your candidacy, that is, given your background, etc., or was it because of other factors? And if you could comment not only in terms of your campaign and perhaps other campaigns that you have been involved in to kind of kick off the discussion. Because we're recording.
I think a huge factor had to be just the representation, the lack of representation here in Visalia. I mean, you could also add in there the fact that we knocked on a lot of the high propensity voters' doors, especially, me, myself, Randy, and our volunteers. But I think one of the things that I used, Eddie Valero, he was a huge help. He said, if you can't get a hold of the youngsters in the house, talk to the mother. Encourage the mother. The mother will make them vote, or encourage them to vote. And I think that's one thing that I definitely did was talk to the mother, or the parent figure in the home. And so I think it was a little bit of everything. The quality, the representation, but also the work that we put behind going to every door.
Okay. Any of you want to comment on that?
I would like to add just like add on to representation. I think when we have a candidate here in the Central Valley, which is a region with a large minority population, when we have a candidate that reflects their values, looks like them, it kind of encourages young people, or especially young people, to continue voting and being involved in this electoral process, which eventually will affect their lives now and in the future.
You want to add anything, Marcus? Okay. You need to speak louder. Yeah, it is. It is. Okay, you have to project. All right. Are there? Let me ask one more question, and perhaps I'll start with you, Marcus, if you don't mind. What I'd like to ask you is, given your experience in terms of having a group of friends, a circle of friends, and so on, and given what happened just last week right here in Visalia and so on, did you have a sense that a lot of the people you knew who could vote were in fact going to work, or was there still some skepticism, some cynicism, it doesn't matter kind of attitude, or yeah, I'll do it, but then in fact maybe they didn't? Did you get a sense of where your circle of friends or people that you knew, and whether in fact they were going to vote, and if not, why not?
So, disclaimer, I'm from Dinuba, so I can't really speak to what Visalia.
I'm sorry. I know Dinuba Emperor just totally turned me off. So go ahead.
But as far as my group of friends, I know that absolutely none of them had interest in voting. Unfortunately, I'm the one friend that's like, come on, you guys, let's do it. Come on, let's go out. Let's be involved in politics. Come to this campaign. And it very rarely works, which is unfortunate because my friends, it's not that they're not involved, because we definitely have conversations about politics and things we would like to see change in our community. But I just don't think that they have the kind of desire and oomph to go to the polls and vote. And I think that's a lot of just the education that they have. I feel like being a law major, I'm exposed to a lot of like policy and this and that, and that's kind of what I'm encapsulated in. But my friends are, I think, plant majors, bio majors. I think one's in like floriculture. So I think just their interests don't align with what mine do. So it's hard for me to kind of shame them when I know it's something I'm really interested in and they're not. So, you know. But
Yeah, so we all know that the age range of 18 through 29 has the lowest voting rates, unfortunately. But I would say that I've surrounded myself with people that are pretty politically active. I mean, just like people in the Democrats Club, we keep them involved and informed of like recent like political events or such. And kind of like Marcus, I'm the one that's like, come on guys, let's go do it, let's go do it. I'm that person in the family. I'm that person informing everybody of like new propositions, what this candidate does and what they stand for. So I would pride myself in being surrounded by people that like this electoral process or are willing to become educated. But I still think there is this lack of education and kind of exposure. But that kind of goes back to our school systems and how we lack the willingness to educate young people just in general.
Manuel?
And then I just turned 30 recently, and I'm actually guilty of this. I didn't start voting until I was probably 26. And I would say from my experience, it was lack of education. I didn't understand, especially with local politics, how 70 to 80% of what we deal with on a daily basis are decisions that are made at the local level. And so we always would think of just the presidency and the governmentship for states, and that's the only time I would go vote, or I would show any interest in it. But it wasn't enough to actually get me to go vote. But I think seeing young leaders like Ryan Osorio, Eddie Valero, it kind of inspired me at that age to actually go out and vote, volunteer for some of these campaigns. 1 hour a weekend, or every other weekend, and I think just more of us doing that will eventually just increase those numbers as we're seeing. I think this election in some states, they saw huge increases in youth turnout, and it helped in some of these elections. So that's my experience.
Okay. Any questions from the audience now to any of the panelists and so on? Ms. Arroyo.
Well, I know for me personally, even though I'm involved in politics, that little mail, what's it called? The voter registration ballot? The mail-in ballot? Or are we talking about the voter registration guide? Oh, the ballot. Oh, I definitely believe that ballot helped for sure, because I think just the ease of being able to fill it out in advance and then take it to the polls. And I saw that being a poll worker, I think in Dainubo we got 30 people to vote in person, and then the mail ballots was like majority of our votes. So yeah, I definitely believe that made it a lot easier for a lot of people.
I think that's interesting that you make that point, because I would make the assumption that regardless of it being a mail-in ballot, if people are uninterested, they won't care that it's a mail-in ballot. So I would, in my opinion, I would say that regardless of it being a mail-in ballot or having people get the voter registration guide to their homes, if people are uninterested in the electoral process or being involved in voting, that wouldn't really make a difference, unfortunately. But we all know how crucial it is to be, have this civic duty. But I feel like if people are not interested, not educated enough on the importance of voting or just voting in general, they won't do it regardless.
Do you have a comment, Manuel?
I don't have much to add there. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Question, Lucia?
Actually, I want to respond to that comment. I think in Goshen, I did a lot of voter education and a lot of voter registration. And in Goshen, I have a contact there, Lucy Hernandez, that lives in West Goshen, active in PTA, active in all this stuff. And she told me, I have people that want to vote, but they're afraid to register because they don't know how. And so we were able to get her a list of voters, and she was able to do we did what we did for about a week or so. I had the legal voters out there. We tried to register voters. We did stuff. I saw her the Friday before election. She said, "See, I just dropped off 15 ballots," and she was just thrilled. And that was from like a week's worth of work. So it's not having them there is one thing, but feeling confident in what you're doing, feeling confident that being able to be that middle person and just say, and it has to come from somebody that you trust and you know. Research shows us that the farther away you get from your own zip code, the less effective you are. So, yeah, having it is one thing, but having somebody to help you with it when you're not when you're zero or a young voter really needs to do.
Okay, thank you for the comment. Any other questions from anyone in the audience? No one? Yes? Yeah? Yeah, okay, one. Anyone? Yeah.
So this summer, I was fortunate enough to be part of California Freedom Summer. This kind of stemmed from Dr. Villegas's and Dr. Tricas from UCLA's Central Valley Freedom Summer. So our initiative was to get people or students to register to vote, young voters to register to vote here in the Central Valley. And some of the things we did, we went to classrooms to do in-classroom presentations on educating people on the importance of voting, how you could vote, how to register to vote, and then we would give out QR codes so that they could have easy access to the online registration. So one thing that I would say was kind of useful was kind of getting tech savvy with young people through social media. We were able to relate with them through QR codes because we saw that the written voter registration document wasn't really what they needed. They wanted to do the online voting registration. So I think a lot of ways to engage young people to register to vote or just be involved would be through being tech savvy with them.
I also feel like a way to definitely get young people engaged is to show them how voting can directly cause results. I feel like, me and Crystal were both in the California Freedom Summer, and going to community colleges, which is College of Sequoia, we saw that a lot of people were either already made up their minds whether they were already registered or whether they weren't going to register and not going to vote. But in high school, we were able to get a lot more students to pre-register to vote. So I feel like teaching students about voting and about politics young in high school when they're still able to like kind of get a grasp and then carry that with them when they go into college. Because in college, a lot of your classes are tailored to your interests. So it's hard to get every student to get a uniform education versus high school where you can teach them about policy and this and that, and everyone will receive the same. So I feel like that would be best.
Do you have a comment, Matt?
And speaking to their mothers, remember. No, when I talk to people where I live in the barrio, when they saw me, just my youth and who I was, a lot of them just that alone excited them to want to vote. People that weren't even registered, or people that I didn't hit low propensity voters' doors as much as I wanted to. But if I saw somebody outside that wasn't on my list, I would still stop and say hi and kind of just introduce myself. And a lot of those people, I would like to think that they did go out and vote because of that interaction. But I think the door-to-door, which me, Lucia, Suzanne Gundy, and a couple others were doing since the beginning of last year, every other weekend, something that we got to continue to do to educate. It's always a lack of education, whether it's how to register, where's your Dropbox location, how much time do you have to actually fill it out? What do you have to fill out, right? You don't have to fill out the whole ballot. Sometimes it's a little too much for some people, and hey, I know these two things, I'll vote for these two and turn it in, right? That's all they got to do. And so I think just the lack of education is the main thing, and just trying to figure out ways in different areas of trying to attack that for different populations of people.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yeah, it's proper right now for us to talk a lot about elections because we just had one. But you know, the majority of politics happens between elections. The majority of politics, because elections don't represent all of politics. So you folks are really, as elected people, kind of teachers. What can you do to keep not only young people but everybody interested in the fact that you got elected and that something is now going to happen? What you have a plan for getting into the community, your perspective, general perspective, or what have you, in order to help guarantee that those voters come back at the next election and vote again?
We'll start with you, Manuel. Obviously. Not just talk to the mothers, right?
Yeah, not just talk to them about it. I think one thing that I will continue to do, and maybe once a weekend, again, get with Dr. Lucia Vasquez and a couple others and continue to register voters and also educate while we're out there. But also just bringing, events into the area and being accessible, kind of calling it like office hours in areas that normally you wouldn't see a politician. We have businesses by the Oval. I've never seen a politician there. Hanging out there on a weekday, having coffee and just being accessible, and having these partnerships with people like Dr. Randy Villegas and Eddie, and also inviting them so that it's an open space for them to come and ask those questions that they probably wouldn't ask, or just being available to, make them comfortable or have a conversation, or just show them that, we're here for them and we're going to do our best, right? But I think the biggest thing is bringing that sense of culture back to the area. I talk to a lot of people, voters, that live near the Oval, and they talk about how there used to be events for September 16th. This past September 16th, there was really nothing going on the north side, and I thought of doing something, but with the election, it was really hard, and people were really busy. But bringing events like that and bringing a sense of culture, and at that location having the education, a booth there that can educate, or just in general talk about what's going on and what we want to do, and how you can help, right? A lot of people will come up to me and ask me, how can I help? Well, we have city council meetings every first and third Monday. I can tell you when this topic's going to come up. Come in and talk in support of it. It can influence maybe one of these council members or two, because essentially we need 3 to pass anything, right? But just being out there and available, I think, will help a lot, because a lot of times these people think that we're not accessible, or you forget about us. And I always tell everybody where I live, because I live in the community, right? And it's like where I live. You have my phone number. Contact me whenever you need to, and I want to make this as easy as possible as I can for you to understand how it works and what you can do, and hopefully for me that'll be enough, to keep them engaged.
You want to add anything? Okay. This gentleman over here had his hand up first, so if I can call him first, and then your question. Okay.
I tried that, like a lot of us are reactive and like short-sighted, and so like I wonder, to those of us who feel disenfranchised, disillusioned with it, might even be able to say, voting is a sort of tokenism, because I see people just voting on party lines. We're not reading those manuals that come and give the descriptions of the people. And when we read those assembly bills or senate bills, and if I can recall one, Lucy, there was that one about Indian gambling. But then it also lets private people do something else, and then it has that one thing at the bottom where it talks about the if it's going to cost us or not, if it's going to be a surplus or a deficit.
Deficit.
Yeah, and so it just feels like they're playing to like the lowest common denominator of the voter, and I understand it is important to get numbers out, but quality is important too, and so what would you say to the all of the cost of looking for some kind of savior in the flesh or something. And so I wonder what he can say to somebody who is disillusioned with just checking boxes.
Okay.
So I definitely agree. Voting has become so partisan, and I think
Licenciada,
just the two
quiero
dominant parties are
introducirla, si me
control
permite.
kind of
¿Sí?
makes voting very.
Hoy
It's
es-
a big concern of a lot of
Oh,
young voters. Like, what's the point? Like, my vote doesn't
me
matter.
permite introducirla, sí.
And I think
No sé si
just
quiere tomar
keeping that
un poco de
education that
palabras,
keeping that
2
thought
o
that
3
education
minutos,
would be
algo
the
por el
way to
estilo.
kind of
Sí, está bien.
push forward. Like, no, look, there's
Sí, perdón.
although it is so partisan, but if you really do your research and really kind of look at the different and do the different policies, you can.
Es que
Sorry,
se
I
ve
lost my train of
usted
thought
tan
there.
joven.
No, it's okay. But if you allow people to do their research and give them the education and the resources to show, like, look, this is what's out there, this is the different policies, and unfortunately, yeah, a lot of policies do have that kind of little hidden implications of it, but I think just kind of progressing and allowing politics to be as transparent as possible, and that's something that has been so not prevalent in the past. Is politics and voting and everything has been so secretive, and I feel that as we progress with everything and allow more people to be part of politics, it will be easier to be able to see what you're voting for, who you're voting for, and hopefully not make everything so partisan.
I would like to say I think it's pretty unfortunate that a lot of people have been disillusioned by the initial act of voting itself. That people feel that their voice or their opinions don't matter. But I think a way that we could fix this issue is by electing officials that you believe are transparent with policies and that represent your needs and your values. And I think that could be kind of difficult right now, especially when we have candidates that are not really transparent with the policies that they want to push for when elected. But I think it's really important that we continue advocating for. That we continue advocating for people in our community that meet our needs and our standards, and that will continue filling in these spots that we need to fix.
I think when I knock on these doors and I have that one-on-one conversation with people, and a lot of people will vent sometimes in those conversations. You can always talk about the things that are most relatable about what's going on in the city to what they're bringing up in these conversations to kind of get them a little engaged initially. But at the end, when it comes to voting, you're right, it is partisan. I always tell people, and again, this goes again to the lack of education. You don't have to vote for the best of the two evils, and that itself makes someone feel better a lot of times because I know myself. I sometimes I will not vote for the lesser of two evils, and I just won't. In California, we have that luxury. In other states, I probably would second guess that I wouldn't not vote, for that particular race. But just realize, letting people know that, hey, this is, you don't have to vote for this or him or her, him or whoever it is, uh, and then just kind of, you know, letting them know what there is available out there, what committees, commissions are out there that they can get involved with, where they can have a say in some of these things that they may care about, can help in keeping them engaged throughout the process. I know in the city of Visalia, the Citizens Committee Advisory always has openings, and there's a couple of different ones that I'll advertise when I'm talking to someone that seems like they feel like they're not being heard, but they want to be, have their voice heard, that this is a way to start to get in the process. Or, hey, put your name in the hat, kind of like I did, and give it your all and see what happens, right? But it's definitely difficult to keep someone engaged for 40 years, for this race. And that's why you see a lot of the advertising and us knocking on doors closer to that. But I hope to change that by knocking on doors, like I said, throughout the term, and kind of just, letting them know what's going on at the moment, and hoping that will catch their ear and help them get involved with the city a little bit more.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Your turn. Can you speak a little louder, please? Louder. Very good. Yeah. So, next. Yes. A little louder, please. You're being recorded. This is a streamed event. Okay. Well, one of the reasons I asked Marcus to be on this panel is I saw him sing on TikTok. So maybe he can start with.
So actually, I am currently on a social media break, so I do not have TikTok. But I do agree that technology, and I don't want to speak for sure because I don't know the future of politics, but I definitely think that technology is going to be one of the main kind of forces for like continuing government, because I think it's the easiest way to kind of instantly be in contact with someone, and that accessibility makes it so much easier. Bless you. And I think that just technology would promote so many things and make it so much easier. And obviously there are some consequences, but that's, not for right now. But yeah, I think that technology would allow for like the youth to be involved, and definitely with social media. That's our main form of kind of communication across the board. Sorry. So I think that if we were to, especially with people running campaigns, to get involved in TikTok, I think we were telling me and a few COS Democrats members were telling Vegas to start a TikTok. Say what you're running for, your campaigns, why you're running, and that's the easiest way to get in touch with you.
Yeah, just kind of to repeat what Marcus said, I had previously mentioned that we need to be a little bit more tech savvy with this newer generation of people, and I would agree. Or people have already began proposing their campaigns on TikTok and other social media platforms. But when we become involved with like the newest generations, like social media and stuff, we're going to be able to engage them most. And kind of like what Marcus said, we were trying to convince Dr. Villegas to start a TikTok, and me and Paloma were going to be running it for him. We wanted to do his social medias. So we were prepared to help him with all the social media aspects. So we all know everybody's on or younger people are always on their phone. So that would be an easy way for us to reach that demographic.
I think also the quality of candidate that you have, someone like AOC, look what she was able to do in New York there. And having candidates like that in position or running for positions where they have more of a say with things that relate to younger folk, like student loans and the wealth gap, which are things that kind of college students, I think, are more worried about than they are about infrastructure, kind of like in these local races, where it's more of a family-oriented older folk that you want to target. But I think the type of quality of candidate that you have, I know there's another guy, Caesar, who ran for Congress in Texas, who also had, I think, a huge voter turnout. And again, I think the candidate also, besides the social media, has to do with that engagement of the youth vote.
Thank you for the question. Oh, Bernadette was next. Yes.
I'd like to comment back on your comment, because apathy is not our friend here in this situation. We just had this wonderful presentation about the importance of elections and results, and the significance of one or two votes making a difference in that. And you talked about the propositions and how they're designed to be very ambiguous and confusing. They do that by design, and they always have to have that fiscal disclosure at the end. But again, and then going back to your point about the lesser of two evils, consider how evil that evil is. Sometimes it comes down to that. That's just what the reality of it. So I'm getting real passionate about this because it is so important. So we can't let apathy. So my suggestion is find someone you trust, someone you know, someone knowledgeable to walk you through all those things. That's what we all have to do. That's what I do if I'm not. I said, you see, I can help me out here. She's smarter than I am. So I go to her. So find someone that you can consult with, because we're not doing ourselves any favors if we're not, for any reason,
Yeah.
checking those boxes.
And that can be done easily on social media.
Yes.
Question. Yes. Ladies first. Okay. Crystal, I'll let you ask or respond first.
Well, to be completely transparent, I'm not aware of any type of youth like programs or campaigns that will specifically help like youth voices become empowered to speak against city council or speak against the school board or such, which is very unfortunate because it's kind of ironic that we say that we want youth to be involved in this electoral process, but we consistently shut them down. And that was one of the talking points that I was going to bring up in one of the panel questions is age is such a big factor with the electoral process, not just because there's such a big margin gap of people not being involved, registered to vote, but because people believe that age is experience and like their willingness to work and experience here in like the electoral process. So when they're consistently shut down and belittled for their opinions, I mean, it kind of creates this gap between people and they're not going to be willing to be involved. So I think it's really unfortunate that I really can't think of any program on the top of my mind that will help young people get their voices heard in city council.
Yeah, I haven't heard of anything, but besides Facebook groups wanting something like a pool, here in Visalia, that's probably the hot topic is the community pool, and what it should consist of, where it should go, and if we should even have one, right? I think seeing that group, it's having someone that's informed of how the process works. I think that's important. You got to have kind of like an advisor to that group to teach them the process, and so that they can put their energy where it should go. But no, we don't have anything like that here. It's something that we probably should look into, and see how we can use that young energy to get things moving or talked about or brought up.
Maybe my favorite has youth grants,
To be continued. We have one more question, three more questions. Um, so we're getting near the end of the Q&A. So allow me to interfere for 60 seconds. Um, in 1933, here in Pixley, very close by, during a cotton strike, the consul, the Mexican consul representing the Mexican government, became involved in trying to defend the rights of the strikers, most of whom at that time were of Mexican origin, born in Mexico for the most part. And I'm very happy to introduce the new person who will be in charge of the consulado for this region, who was nice enough to come here and be present. So I'd like to introduce Licenciada González Carrillo. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Adriana González, Head Consul of Mexico, and also is with me Nuria Zuniga, Deputy Consul. I'm not from the Foreign Service, I have to say this. She is from the Foreign Service. But I want to let you know this, and it's very important for us to be here. Thank you, Alex, and thank you, Nelly, for this great exhibition named Caminos. And it reflects the history of our community here in the Central Valley, which is very important. And I want to say that I was elected because my background is in politics. So I was first elected for the Congress, for the Federal Congress, when I was 28. Later, at 31, I was elected for the Federal Senate. And I get back to the Congress again for a third term, which it mainly was 12 years in total. So for me, it's very important to see that the community is also reflected in all the positions, and especially with young people. And you inspire me a lot. So thank you for sharing this and for sharing all these stories. And thank you also for trying to make that everybody can feel that they are represented in this area. Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Questions. One would be for all the professors that are just answer. When we talk about our youth, Restream and having to vote, how many of those youth people, 29, would be repeat voters within that same age group? And that way, that answer gives you a little time. With all of you doing that great work, knocking on doors, you know, thank you for your work and hard effort. What was one of your biggest surprises when you guys were knocking on doors? I think we all have preconceived idea of what people want from politicians. But what was like your aha moment or surprise moment when having that conversation with you guys, listening to them, to kind of walk away and say, you know what, I never saw that perspective. When we're knocking on doors. The first one for any that could answer repeat voters. What's the percentage for that?
I don't have an exact percentage number, but I will say, it's typically
more consistently every 4 years, right? Like Manuel was saying, a lot of folks don't know that we have midterm elections every 2 years. We elect our state officials, our local representatives as well. So I don't have a consistent number for that, but certainly it grows over time, and we've seen that throughout history. In terms of your second question, the kind of aha moment, a lot of people, and Manuel can speak to this, a lot of people thought I was trying to sell them solar. So it was good to let them know, like, hey, I'm not trying to sell you solar. You're good. But at least for me, it was really connecting with parents. Many of them who they themselves had not been able to get a GED, or they came from Mexico, like my parents. And, I would tell them, hey, I want to make sure all of our students, whether they want to go to college, the military, trade school, or start work right away, that we can open those doors for them. And I think connecting to those issues, and also folks who didn't have, often I would get people who are like, well, all my kids are grown. They're all away. They're gone away to college. And so I don't vote for school board. And I tell them, no, well, you're still a resident, you're still a registered voter, and it's about all of our kids in the community, all of our students, and all of their futures, and the opportunities that we can provide them. So I think connecting with people across cultures, age. Some people told me I was too young to run to vote, or sometimes I'd knock and hand them the flyer, where I'm dressed in a suit, but I would not be dressed in a suit, knocking on doors and be like, "That's you," and I'm like, "Yeah, that's me. I'm just not dressed up." And so just being able to tell them, like, we want to fight for our communities, we want to fight and champion our students. I think just being able to build that connection with people was kind of the aha moment across age, culture, religion, ethnicity. Sometimes there were language barriers with some of our Lao folks or Hmong folks where I couldn't speak the same language, right? I was able to speak Spanish to many folks, but then it was, using keywords, giving them the flyer, telling them I still have my phone number, right, if you want to reach me, or even asking one of their children to translate, and then we were able to have a conversation in that way, right? But again, accessibility and being available to folks.
Can I take the... We have another candidate who ran. Can you answer? Would you mind making a comment about the question? This is Suzanne Gundy.
Hi, guys. I'm definitely not a youth. But what I found was when I was out campaigning that it's the person-to-person thing. And just say, hey, you know what? I was at a booth in down in Bakersfield because that's part of the district I was in. I ran for state senate, so went from Bakersfield up to Visalia, up to Clovis, and out by the Indian Reservation. But I just would say, hey, guys, passing by, you can vote for me. They said, what? 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 I said, hey, you don't have to vote for everybody, but you can vote for me. And just to have a contact with people. Now, I'm the kind of person who likes to say hello. When I'm out walking around, I was an exchange student as a teenager, and I was fortunate to be able to go to Austria and Italy. And there in the villages and in the towns, even in the big cities, people say hello. We don't do that here. We pass somebody and it's like, but just say hi. I'm a human being. You're a human being. Let's just have a brief interaction. So I think going to people's homes, or even just when you're walking around, say hi to people. Just say, hey, I'm a city council person. If you have something that you need to talk to me about or talk to somebody about, come talk to me. But I think it's a matter of making it personal, having the other person feel that you are connecting with them. And I know we can't do that to like 100,000 people, but that's what we and our campaigners can do.
Yeah. Suzanne Gundy was running for office in State Senate District 12. Unfortunately, yeah. Did you want to respond, Mark?
For me was the language barrier. Just being able to talk in Spanish to them, and then being excited that they have that open way of communication now with someone that has an impact on their lives and what's around them. I think that was one of the biggest ones. And then for people that didn't speak Spanish, realizing what the demographics of this district were and the needs, and also knowing that I speak that language and able to communicate and have that that communication with people that speak Spanish. But again, it is hard when we have other communities like the Lao community, which is difficult. something that we can definitely work on in the future for different, for future campaigns.
So I had previously campaigned for Brian Osorio in the state Senate race, and I was campaigning for Dr. Villegas. And aside from getting the door shut in my face or having the flyers ripped in half right in front of me, one of the biggest, or I remember this conversation I had with an older woman. I told her that I was campaigning for Dr. Villegas. He was running for the school board, and she said, I don't have any kids in the school district, or I don't have any kids at all. So when people are not educated on they still have the ability to vote despite them not having any children, and when people aren't educated on that and the importance of continuing to vote for specifically the school districts, because that is our future generations, there will be this absence of participation just in general.
Okay, so I've only been campaigning actually once. It was, I think, the last time for Emmanuel and then Villegas. And I think within the 2 hours we were campaigning, me and the partner I was assigned with, Jasmine, got maybe 25 houses, or not 25 houses, maybe so. But out of those, only 3 of them answered. Only one of them listened to us, and she spoke Spanish, and I speak Spanish. So Jasmine was able to communicate with her for maybe a good 20, 30 minutes, like a good conversation about, just all the problems we see in politics nowadays, and how so much of this can be changed just with proper representatives and proper candidates. So I think it's really hard to say what the biggest moment was for me, because that's what it was limited to. But I would just say how it's sad seeing how many people are home but still won't answer the door just because they don't really want to hear what you say. Because I saw some people run into the house and close the door, and I'm walking up the steps. I'm going to ring on the doorbell regardless. You might as well open it. Yeah, so I think that was a little kind of discouraging, but I think it was also definitely an eye-opener about how just people don't want to hear it, they won't hear it, so.
Okay, all right. If I may just say the last comment before we break, one of the nicest things that I read when I asked the panelists to send me their bio sketches was when Crystal said that she wanted to work on bipartisan solutions. And despite all of the joking, including my own joke about Republicans and so on, to me, that's a beautiful comment to make, given the current polarization in our politics. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Randy? Great.